And hello and a very warm welcome to all of you for the session on Ukraine, the global food security and the role of business. Thank you also, Paul, and your panel for setting up our discussion so well in terms of the context of food systems. My name is Ayatollah Shaman. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Business Fights Poverty. We're a social impact business network. I'm joined by an amazing panel of individuals to talk through the issues around the impact on global food security and the role of business, and I'll introduce them very shortly. Like many of you, Business Fights Poverty has been very active on Ukraine from the moment of the invasion. For us, with conflict happening right around the world, it's one of the drivers of poverty, of the impact on the lives, the livelihoods, and the access to learning of people all over the world, especially the most vulnerable. And when you add in the impacts of COVID and of climate change, we're seeing a tsunami of poverty right around the world. And that applies to this case as well. So it's of big concern to us. And like many of you, we were pretty active from the early start of this invasion. With Crown Agents, our partner, we launched our rapid response facility for Ukraine. And a colleague of mine will post a link to that in the chat if you're interested. So in this context, we've decided to focus on the impact of the crisis in Ukraine on the rest of the world. We know that for many countries, including not least in Africa, as was mentioned by President Zelensky just yesterday in his address to the African Union, many countries are very dependent on Russia and or Ukraine for wheat, for fertilizers, for other really critical food resources. Sudan, for example, something like 80% of its wheat imports come from Russia and Ukraine, 95% of its sunflower oil. So there's a really massive implication of what's happening in Ukraine for the rest of the world. And that's what we want to focus on in this particular webinar, and looking at that from the role of business as well, from that perspective. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our panel. We're joined by Tatiana Korochenko, who is the Managing Director of Crown Agents Ukraine, by Keith Kibarango, who's the Director of Philanthropy and Private Sector Engagement at Crown Agents, by Ian White, Special Representative UK and Ireland from the World Bank. So welcome to all of my panel. This is going to be an interactive session, so please do introduce yourself in the chat function. My colleague Anna will be in the chat, looking out for any questions you might have, any comments you might have. So please do get active in there, and we'll get those questions to our panel a little bit later on in this session. So let's kick things off then. Tatiana, perhaps you could start by setting the scene for us around what is the situation in Ukraine right now with regards to food security. Tatiana, over to you.
Can you hear me right now? This is great. So thank you so much for inviting. It's the first time I am in this event, so a little bit nervous. So please excuse if I will be a little bit not contingent in my speech, but an extremely important event, I think. I'm not an expert in food security at all. So I am managing Crown Agents Ukraine office for the last 5 years, and our company has been in Ukraine for more than 25 years, managing different projects. And food security was not part of it. But this issue is kind of close to my heart because part of my family is actually small farmers at the north of Ukraine. And from being a child, I was always hearing that food is not a weapon, food is not a weapon. And when my elder brother was just doing the planting, means the bomb shelling, that was just something that I will remember for the rest of my life. So I think it is important to understand that though there is a very difficult times in Ukraine, but Ukraine is not failing at all as a state. Ukraine not failing at all as a business partner, and Ukraine is not failing at all as a very powerful civil society country. So that is something that I wanted to convey to everybody, saying that it's just not only humanitarily supporting us, but also working with us, continue working with us in a commercial way. Just probably bearing in mind this new reality. It's something that Ukraine and me as being Ukrainian, what we are waiting for. So the whole system of supply chain, and this is where the Crown Agents is probably one of the oldest experts, the whole system of the world supply chains are now changing. And it looks like that we will be living in this new reality for years and years ahead. So from Ukraine's perspective, I can say that being in Ukraine for so long and working in Ukraine for so long, I always admired the sophisticated level of the agriculture infrastructure in Ukraine. And I'm so proud that nevertheless, there is a huge difficulties. The systems are still working. I've been in contact with a couple of companies that we are also dealing with. It's the companies that also working in supply chain services, and they were linked to mostly agriculture and exporting food. They said that the system that we have in Ukraine is quite agile. It is adapting to the system. But the question sometimes is that whether the rest of the world is ready to adapt to these systems. Because these chains that we were establishing for years and years are suddenly cut off. And Ukraine is desperately looking for opening of the new routes. I was also kind of excited to hear that Ukraine started exporting grains through the railways. That is a big challenge, because for those who are working with Ukraine, you probably know that we have a slightly different railroad system. It's not even railroad, but it's a technical specification of our rolling stock. So nevertheless, I was amazed to hear that actually first tankers with Ukrainian grains are now traveling all around the world. So there is a possibility to change that, and to change that within such a short period of time, which for us Ukrainians is almost ages as 4 months. So this again proves that Ukraine is not failing. So the commercials are not failing. So we are working, and support here is, I think that's vitally important. And the close cooperation with our partners, that is, I think, what will save the situation. So that's that's shortly what I wanted just to kick off. So something, a little bit of personal and a little bit from my cap as the head of the Crown Agents Ukraine, and our expertise in supply chains.
Thank you, Tatiana. I think that sort of point there about Ukraine not failing is such an important one, and well taken. Thank you for making that. Keith, yes, over to you.
I just wanted to provide, probably Tanya, to provide you another opportunity to talk about some of the other challenges that are affecting the agriculture within Ukraine before I start talking about the impact it is having on the rest of the world, especially when we're talking about the mining of the agricultural lands, because that is also a challenge that we probably cannot ignore when it comes to ensuring that we can feed the world.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Keith, for pointing that out. Again, that is something that probably the world never envisaged before. So according to the very rough estimate, 85 square kilometers of Ukraine territories are potentially affected by mines, all type of mines. And on top of that, we need to add the mining of the ports. So which means that there is a lot of discussions already about reconstruction, about returning to normal, about rebuilding the bridges, about rebuilding the housing, about rebuilding the storage facilities for grains, but nothing can be done unless the territory is clean. Because the last thing that we want to see is just to put in danger our citizens, whereas we are already bombed by the neighboring country. So that is becoming vitally important. And again, my family had that experience because the lands that my family is using to the north of Ukraine is actually like lands bordering with the Russian Federation. I have to say that Ukrainian demining authorities are doing their best, but the volumes are incredible. So we do have a trained personnel, but the quantity of equipment required is enormous. So this is where I think the support to Ukraine will be absolutely vital. And this is where our partners can be of real help.
Thank you, Tatiana. Yeah, I want to come back in the conversation, some very practical things that those people listening can do, both in terms of what's happening within Ukraine. I mean, you mentioned demining there, which is heartbreaking. And I guess that process could take many, many years from experience of other countries. but also you talked about infrastructure and so on. So let's come back to some of those very practical things in just a minute. I want to turn though to you, Keith, because clearly the impact, as terrible as it is in Ukraine, is having an impact right around the world, not least across the African continent. Can you maybe speak to us a bit about what you're seeing in Africa at the moment?
Thank you so much, Zahid, and thank you for this opportunity. And this conversation segues well from what President Zelensky talked about when he was talking to the African Union, when he mentioned that basically Russia is kind of holding Africa to ransom. And this is really, really true. As Crown agents, we work in almost all countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. And what we have been experiencing in the last 3 years are continued failing rains. And if the rains are not failing, then there's flooding. So you're having parts of the Horn of Africa that are yo-yoing between floods and extreme heat and weather. And this is coming from on the back of COVID-19, which disrupted so much of our daily lives and also the supply chains. So not only are you having 3 years of successive famine in countries like Ethiopia, Somalia, northern Kenya, you now add the Ukrainian war to that. And to just put this in perspective, Nigeria is the 4th largest importer of food from Ukraine and Russia in the world. And Nigeria is a population of more than 300 million people. When you look at Egypt, 85% of their wheat comes from Ukraine and Russia. When you look at Tanzania, Uganda, Cameroon, Malawi, 40% of their wheat comes from Ukraine and Russia. So anything that happens in Ukraine has a direct impact on food security that is already strained. Since the beginning of the war, the prices of food have gone up 25%. So we are talking about communities that have already been struggling, and now they have to pay an exorbitant amount to be able to put food on their table. And that is why we are having this unprecedented number of over 40 million people in the Horn of Africa that are food insecure, that will actually be vulnerable to famine. And as Tatiana was talking about, the numbers we're beginning to talk about are enormous. So you cannot divorce what is happening in Ukraine to the impact that we are seeing in Sub-Saharan Africa. And as such, we really need to think of solutions that address the immediate effects of drought today, but also ensure that people in these parts of the world get to be more resilient and have climate-busting solutions to these challenges. So Zahid, I will stop there for now because I'm sure other people will have to chip in. We want to chip in and ask questions, but right now, that is the impact that we are having, whereby the World Food Programme, the money that it had, not only is it not enough for the region because the prices are higher, but it also has had to then respond to Ukraine. So it's all interconnected and in a really soul-destroying way. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Keith. Yeah, it's almost incomprehensible to understand the scale of the wave that's going to be breaking right across the continent as a result of this. Ian, I mean, Keith mentioned it there, but also we heard in the panel just before this that Paul moderated, there are some big systemic issues and trends that have been happening for a while, actually. How do you see this from the World Bank perspective, connecting? How do you see what's happening in Ukraine exacerbating, in a sense, some of these threats to food security?
Thanks, Zahid. It's good to be here. I think I'll start by picking up on 2 points, one that Tatiana made and one that Keith made. I think you already echoed it, Zahid, that Ukraine is not failing. And I think, I guess we're out of the gate with this event that we perhaps have the most important one line of the hour, because I think in the World Bank's experience, we've committed $4 billion to Ukraine. A lot of that is the bank's sort of core balance sheet, our own resources. But significant amounts have come in from other countries, major donors, including the UK, which I covered, to help boost and provide additional finance to Ukraine. And that is all, that 4 billion is through the government of Ukraine, because it's the most important thing is to support and sustain the institutions, the businesses and civil society in Ukraine at the moment, because as Tatiana said, these are under pressure, under strain. It's conflict zone in parts of the country, but they're still very much functioning and need to be supported. So that's one very important part, and I think will be an important part of the overall response for the international community. And then the other point, which Keith has already spoken to, is the global impact that this is having, and it's not the start of the global food crisis. It's definitely accelerated a trend that already existed and put incredible strain on supply chains and on particular countries. Keith mentioned several of them, ones that do directly import food from Ukraine, from Russia, as well as food inputs such as fertilizers. Those are the countries that are going to be disproportionately impacted and already are being disproportionately impacted. But if I were to sort of, step back, and we've been facing a situation of growing global food insecurity since 2014, really. And the number of people who are acutely food insecure has been progressively increasing year on year since 2014. And unfortunately, last year hit the global high of 193 million in 2021, which was up, I believe, 40 million on 2020. And this year looks like it's going to be even worse. And Keith has already alluded to those factors: COVID-19, climate change, some real systemic and long-term issues that have shown some vulnerabilities in food systems and food supply chains. And the tail end of the last event, which we caught, it's important to note that it's currently an access problem rather than a supply problem. There is enough food in the world to feed the world's people. It's just an issue of getting it to the right people in the right places, and that people are able to actually afford it in the face of rising food prices. And there is quite an important and urgent piece of work to do to make sure that it doesn't become an issue of supply, which we can perhaps come back to. And then just one final point I'll make is about the global economic backdrop that all this is happening in, because the World Bank, we partner with civil society, other multilateral organizations, the private sector, but we work through governments. So the government piece of it is very important for our response and the work that we do. And you see with the impact that COVID-19 had on the global economy, what we're seeing now, that we have really suppressed growth in many countries and rising inflation, and also very elevated debt levels for many countries. So 60% of low-income countries were in debt distress even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So what that means practically is that it reduces the fiscal space, the headroom for these countries to make decisions and to actually make policy decisions and support the poorest and most vulnerables through, for instance, boosting social safety net programs. So it seems very macro and sort of very detached from the very real human consequences that we're talking about. It does put real strain and limits on how individual countries are able to proactively respond to support their citizens in this situation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ian. So I'd like to now turn the conversation to what we can do about this, and what practically can those listening and all of us do. Please do add your comments and questions and ideas in the chat function. My colleague Anna is there to pass those on to us, so please do get active there. We'll be turning over to the audience very shortly. So in terms of what we can actually do, so Tatiana, so going back to some of the points you were starting to make there around demining and so on, what are the most important practical things, the priorities for action right now for Ukraine that perhaps those listening can get involved in?
Yeah, as I said, the Ukraine has a professional capacity to do that. What we are lacking is basically we are lacking the equipment. So because that is something, basically we call them disposables. Because in order to do that, you have to have, first of all, you have to have protective equipment that will protect those who will be doing the demining. And the second important thing, the necessary equipment to do this demining. That is absolutely vital. And since Crown Agents has been working with Ukrainian government for almost 8 years now, that is in multiple requests that are coming from different ministries asking for support in procuring the special equipment and protective vests and helmets and protective stuff for those who will be doing the demining. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we have to unify a system of issuing certificate of clean territory, as they call it, which means that unless their certificate is received by anybody, it's not allowed to do any activities on the territory that is affected. Again, this is where probably the technical support and advice to the Ukrainian government would be needed because the system is in place. But given our European perspective, we want to have it completely compliant with the requirements of European Union. And that is, again, that is something where probably Ukraine would require some support.
Great, thank you so much. One of the things I've picked up in other conversations in terms of needs, and perhaps you could verify this or add to it, is the issue around financing. My understanding is that a number of farmers depend on financing from, for example, seed input companies, and that current system is not operating at the moment. Is that something you've seen at all in terms of the financing side of this story?
Well, this is, as I said, this is where it becomes a little bit personal because this is where I'm getting information from basically my relatives who are working in this sector. So definitely there is a need to revisit the system of financing. There is a need to revisit the systems of storage because you have to understand that basically for Russians, the critical infrastructure was basically silos. Storage facilities, something that has nothing to do with military, but has to do with the security. So basically now what my contacts are saying is that it's time for inventions. It's time to consider how to replace some traditional storage facilities with probably mobile silo bags or something like that, that will still help to move the products across. So again, as I said, there is a lot of stuff that logistically is unavailable because of the disruptions in logistics. But this is where the assistance and advice and any innovations, Ukraine is extremely open to any innovations now. I think it's a chance for us to bring in all possible innovations in this area and even test it on our territory because this is where we are struggling to get that. So that is in a short term. In a longer term, I think that again, just probably reiterate one more time. Absolutely, we need to revisit the global supply chains and the security of supply chains and avoid any monopolies. So that is what I'm hearing, because that's actually what is leading to the situation when there is enough food, but you cannot transport this food to those, as Ian said, to those who need it. So there always have to be alternatives again, and that is what my contacts are saying, and that is what they are looking at desperately.
Right, thank you so much. I just build off the back of that, Keith, in terms of what business can do, there's in that list, I can imagine already things that business could be thinking about. Can you maybe say a bit more about that?
Absolutely, and I will speak directly at business right now. There are really practical things that can be done here and now. I guess for me, I am looking at this as a challenge that is being addressed at two fronts. The Ukraine front, where the food is being produced and has to leave, and then the Horn of Africa and other parts of the continent where there is really dire need for the food. And I remember what Tanya said earlier today, that it took close to 30 years to demine the Falkland Islands, which are much, much, much smaller than Ukraine. So imagine the size of work that we need to do. And if anyone on this call has the capacity, the one thing that they can do is to help with the demining process. An organization like Crown Agents, we can actually procure and inspect and deliver as many demining equipment as possible to the Ministry of Internal Affairs in Ukraine. And so that is something that can practically be done. Provide Ukraine with the equipment to be able to remove the mines from land and sea, so that slowly they begin to actually produce the wheat that the world needs. But as Tatiana also said, we also need to think of alternative different supply chains. And that can be done through business coming with technical assistance, technical advice. We have got companies in the world that can reach anywhere. You know, everywhere you go, there's a bottle of Coca-Cola in the world. So the experience and the reach of a company like that providing their technical assistance cannot be underestimated. On the side of the Horn of Africa, definitely there are people who are dying here and now because of malnutrition, because of famine. We need to find ways in which we bring some money together, we buy some food from whatever part of the world and provide that food in the short term. But in the long term, I believe what we need, one, is to change attitudes. I come from Africa, and there are tribes where I come from whereby one can really be dying, but they'll never eat their goat. And then you wonder why that is, because for them, their goats equate to wealth, and they would rather die than eat their wealth. So it is all that stuff that those attitudes that need to be changed. We also need to start thinking about how do you actually make what they have commercial, because if they are their routes for pastoralists and farmers to sell their produce within their continent and within the country, that also helps with resilience. And thirdly, there is a huge challenge of water. How does business help with the provision of water? Is business able to provide things like boreholes? So those are certain things that we know if we do it now, the next year and the year after that, there'll be more resilience in this community. So I'll just stop there for now as a hit, but those are some of the ideas that are off the top of my head.
Thanks so much, Keith. Yeah, if you caught the first webinar in this webathon, it was included Jay Nelson, who's a director of the Harvard Kennedy School Corporate Responsibility Initiative. And with Jane, actually, we've been working on understanding of the role of business in situations like this. And it really boils down to using your core business, using your philanthropy, and using your voice. And you know, for anyone listening, you can use one or all of those to make a difference. And it's all about using what you have, whether it's your resources or your knowledge or your networks, but just do something and you can make a difference.
Absolutely, Zahid. And I mean, just as an example, in Kenya, we have got a company called Safaricom that is using their technology, and they're using phones, and they're using their free SIM cards to be able to give pastoralists and farmers information as to where the farming is headed to. We have companies like Davis Shortlift that are producers of swimming pool equipment that are helping with boreholes. I keep going back to companies like Coca-Cola that have got an amazing supply chain. What can they do? So it is Unilever, Associated British Foods. There's so many companies where their core business is around nutrition, and they can do a lot to help. So that is kind of an example I can give.
Great. Thank you, Keith. Ian, you made the point very importantly about the important role of governments in all of this. Clearly, these are really systemic issues, and no one company can really hope to make a difference on their own. How can business partner with organizations like the World Bank and with others to really drive that more systemic change in the longer term, as well as deal with the emergency needs now, but this sort of longer term issue around building resilience? How do you look at that issue?
That's a really good question, Zahid. I'll definitely come back to it if I'm going to do a sort of a three-pronged response to your question, because I just wanted to quickly pick up on a point again, both that Tatiana and Keith made, because they keep raising such interesting points. The first one Tatiana, you mentioned on innovation, and I think that's so important. We've seen it before. I mean, in this discussion, it can sound pretty bleak, the current situation, both in Ukraine and globally, but we've seen it before in global crises, how it has really sparked and really forced innovation, whether it's in energy efficiency, and hopefully now this is an opportunity to spark some real innovation globally in terms of global food supply and food systems, and also in supply chains for food. And there's about 600 million food producers connected to 8 billion consumers. I mean, the world's global food market is massive, and here in the UK, it's pretty astonishing what I can get at my corner shop at a moment's notice. And COVID has really shown just how efficient and sophisticated that sort of supply chain is for food, but how quickly and how fragile it can be disrupted. And a World Bank colleague recently, made a very good visual comparison, picking up on another point you made, both Keith and Tatiana, about rather than having mass producers to one single point of entry, now with growing information connecting consumers to local food producers, you have this, rather than a sort of single line, you have a web connecting producers to consumers, whether it's individuals or small businesses, which is much more resilient and much stronger than just one point of entry. So the role of information and technology is really key in that, both at sort of the large scale for agribusiness, but also, well, it has a very sort of significant upfront cost in many cases, can have a real benefit even for smallhold producers as well. So the role of information is key. And then Zahid, picking up on your point and connect it to the voice part that you mentioned. So what we've seen for many countries, which is natural in times of crisis, multilateralism breaks down. I think a lot of countries implement policies that they think are in their own sort of national self-interest and protectionist. But for instance, policies, export bans, it's something the World Bank has really been advocating and working against, because they drive up food prices significantly. So, last month when India announced an export ban on, I believe it was wheat prices went up 6% in a single day. So I think by our own estimate, export bans imposed since the beginning of the year cover about 20% of the world's trade in wheat and are responsible for about a 9 percentage point increase in world wheat prices. And that's just on one food stuff. So the more that businesses can do to use their voice and the relationship with governments and other stakeholders to encourage and make the case for pro-poor policies and policies that will actually benefit the country and its people and the businesses in the medium and long term, the better. And that's not just export bans, but we've spoken previously, Zahid, about sort of pro-poor policies such as enabling environment for women and migrants to participate fully in the workforce. So I think the voice component is really important, and in many places, businesses have a really strong and important role and can be influential with government where others cannot. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you so much. So please do post your questions in the chat function, and we'll pick those up when we can get to them. I have a question really for you, and it's inspired by the title of one of the sessions that's coming up shortly, actually, which is around rebuilding better. Having been through COVID, a lot of us are talking about how can we rebuild better from this, given that it exposed so many vulnerabilities, equity issues, a whole range of different issues. So if we go back into taking this point, this such important point, Tatiana, around how Ukraine is not failing, how do we nevertheless think about how we move forward from here and put in place, a number of you touched on this already, but if you were going to pick out a few things around how we rebuild better from this context, what would those be? What would that look like? And perhaps in particular, where business can play a role in that. And who would like to pick up on that point first? Tatiana, perhaps I could turn to you first, and the things that you'd like to see done differently, maybe once we come back to this in a year or so.
I think that, well, Ukraine is quite an innovative state, but for me, this war, it's hard to say, but it's also an opportunity. And I think that we will only grow stronger from it. And what is important for me is that it's absolutely incredible opportunities for all sorts of innovations in any sector of the economy. And Ukraine will be very acceptable and actually willing to get that. So for me, I would say that if the priority of my government would be to get on board the craziest innovations possible, that would be really something that I would like to see.
Thank you. Great. That's a challenge put out to everyone listening. And I think we're seeing some great innovations coming out in the context of other issues that we're facing as a planet, whether it's conflict, climate change, or COVID. So I think this is an exception. We can really be thinking about what we can all do here. Keith, would you like to jump in on that question?
I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm an expert at Ukraine. It's just for me addressing the whole issue of hunger and global hunger. And especially when you're looking at some of the hotspots across the continent, sub-Saharan Africa. I think, just to borrow from the whole innovation stance, is that we are no longer surprised that there's going to be drought. We're no longer surprised that there's going to be a famine, that the rains are going to fail. In fact, we now are almost confident that it will get a lot worse before it gets better. But as a global movement, I find that we increasingly rely on the short-term solutions, and those solutions tend to be largely, how do we actually send food down when people are unable to put food on their plates? But this then subsidizes, and after 6 months, we go back to business as usual, and then it happens again in the next dry season. And so for me, I think it's a challenge that we have to give ourselves. And I think, as Ian, you mentioned, the war in Ukraine has not started it. It has just amplified it and made it worse. And actually, for many, many people, before COVID and before the war in Ukraine, many people did not even know what a supply chain was. But now we've had to actually say, okay, stuff just doesn't end up in the supermarket. It comes from somewhere. And now we're acutely aware how vulnerable we are to these supply chains. And so we need to be innovative in that way, in the way we move things around, but also innovative in the way we respond to being able to produce food in certain parts of the world where we know that climate change is having such a dire impact to people who are already vulnerable. So I guess it's a challenge to all of us, businesses, the World Bank, us in the third sector. How do you provide those solutions that ensure that people are resilient? How do you actually sit down and not only plan for a 1-2 year program, which then gets defunded, but you actually are setting up a 20-year-old program that is going to take that community and take that country down a path that will lead to better food security. It needs that amount of time and that amount of investment. In fact, I was speaking to some people in Kenya last month, and they were talking about we need almost an entire generation to shift some of the attitudes towards what these communities should be doing to be able to address food security.
Thank you so much, Keith. Ian, your thoughts?
I think Keith makes a good point about there is, in moments of crisis such as this one, this tension, if you will, because there's limited resources, limited political will, limited international attention to addressing what is a very real, immediate humanitarian emergency in many cases, and a growing one. and putting money towards addressing that, and then also staying focused and staying committed to the long-term development, which has the opportunity of making sure that these things are less frequent or less severe in future. And it's been a challenge at the bank and many other development institutions for a long time, and we have worked hard to respond quite forcefully and proactively to the situation in Ukraine and its spillover effects globally, but at the same time reminding our partners and our shareholders, which are the governments of the world, that we are at our core a development institution and we need to stay focused on those long-term objectives. I spoke a bit about the potential silver lining in terms of innovation, supply chains, but I think also the issue of resilience is incredibly important. How do you build the resilience of communities and institutions? So, these crises are going to continue happening, particularly on the climate change front. Fragility, unfortunately, is been a persistent issue for decades and is likely to continue to be so. So focusing on how you can build the resilience of individuals and communities to deal with those situations when they arise is incredibly important, and investing accordingly, both as businesses, but also working with governments to encourage that they invest accordingly. So again, it's that sort of long-term investment, which is really difficult when you're so resource scarce and so much political tension is rightly focused on immediate humanitarian needs.
Thank you, Ian. One of the things that strikes me is having seen the response to the crisis in Ukraine and to other crises around the world. I wonder whether we're good enough at responding to crises, almost, sort of that preparedness for these sorts of issues. We seem to be almost lurching from one to another. And I wonder if there's a better way to collaborate up front and in advance. I mean, there's some systemic things we can fix and build resilience and so on, but just in terms of the act of partnering to deal with a crisis, I sort of feel we're always just that one step behind where we should be. I mean, Keith, you've been involved in many responses through Crane Agents, and Crane Agents is over 180 something years old.
Yeah.
Have you picked up any sort of thoughts on that around how we can do things better?
I mean, I'm trying not to plug something here, but as Crown Agents, we actually are speaking to you, Zahid, and a few of our partners on how do you actually work with business to better prepare for crisis. And I feel that we have been through COVID-19, and at the height of it all, COVID-19 in India, which was really, really bad. The amounts of people that were dying in a short period of time was phenomenal, that India was literally sucking up, all the resources around COVID around the world. And there are quite a number of companies that were still addressing this new type of crisis with old ways of procurement, old ways of supply chains, old ways of approval that would sometimes be really slow. And then Ukraine happened, which was really, really unfortunate. There are some companies that actually were able to throw all those old ways of responding out of the window to actually respond to that. But there are others that still were talking about, we need these signatures, we need these levels of approval. And they're like, people are dying, people are being bombed. Can't you respond now? And then, deal the internal stuff later. And as Crown Agents, I think what we're now doing is that we're trying to bring together partners and say, we are definitely going to have another crisis somewhere. We're also not out of the woods when it comes to COVID-19. We are far from out of the woods when it comes to Ukraine. We now have a looming crisis in the Horn of Africa. How, as a global company or a company working in these areas, do you support your markets, your supply chain, the communities, and how do you actually better prepare for that? So I don't know, Zahid, if I'm responding to your question, but we now have to almost be ahead of the crises, because there will be a tsunami, there will be an earthquake, there will be another war, there will be another drought. But as businesses, how do we actually prepare? How do you actually, something happens at 3 a.m. in the morning, how do you actually turn off that switch so that you're actually saving lives quickly and saving your business in the process as well? So for me, that is the bit that I want to see done so that you preempt that crisis.
Yeah, thank you, Keith. That's a very practical way, I think, to think through it. I mean, I suppose at the same time, it's understanding how we deal with these bigger long-term issues around, say, resilience or particularly around food systems. Ian, you touched on the issue of voice in your remarks. I'd like to come back to that. I think that's something we probably don't do enough of as a business community, is using our voice to push for those pro-poor policies, to think about how we build resilience. Would anyone like to add to that around voice and what you think business can do right now, but also more broadly around using their voice to drive forward and to rebuild better from this crisis?
I'll let someone else speak.
Okay. Ian, do you want to jump in on that one? Is there anything else you wanted to add on to that point?
Thanks, Zahid. I will, sorry to continue to do this, but the conversation's so good, I'm going to answer that question, but also just build on a point that Keith made before. And it's interesting having discussions with counterparts in the UK and elsewhere about, I feel like unprecedented has become such a worn out term because, working for the World Bank for several years, you keep hearing about unprecedented crisis X, unprecedented crisis Y, and it's true. I mean, statistics don't lie. The experiences of individuals don't lie, that global situations have gotten worse and we've faced one crisis after the next. But I think it's very important in our engagement with governments, with businesses, with partners, to demonstrate that actually the amount of progress that's been made, how this crisis is very different than the last. I mean, we talk about the Horn of Africa, it's the third potential famine and food crisis in about 15 years. So for a lot of donor governments, a lot of individuals, the public, it's almost a fatigue that, we did X billion last time and tried all these different things and we've had no luck. But that's not exactly true. There is actually, this situation is different, and there was real, in addition to saving lives, there was real long-term benefits and gains made last time. So I think when we use our voice, it's important to make that point that previous investments weren't for nothing, that we do know what works. Generally, there was proven track records and things that work well in these situations. We're talking about food crisis. If you have a social safety net program, boosting cash transfers to the poorest households is a proven way of preventing those households from falling into poverty or having to resort, Keith, you made the point about slaughtering or selling the goats, because we know if you don't act early and they have to make that decision and use those assets, yes, they'll live in the immediate term, but then they'll be more asset poor in the long term and more vulnerable and won't have those assets the next time a challenge comes up. So the acting early is also a very important one. And that, I think a lot of that also comes down to good relationships, because, if you're asking, whether it's your business partner or it's a particular community or government, to act now when a crisis or a situation doesn't look that bad, and invest those resources and make those decisions, it's a hard sell in some cases. So I think also long-term sustained relationships are very important to help make those difficult early calls to stave off much worse consequences down the line.
And Zahid, they in today's world, they are businesses that are even more powerful than some nations. And these businesses are operating in some of these countries that are facing the challenges. And if we are to talk about voice, these businesses can actually do a lot of good if they actually spoke out and spoke to and influence some of these governments. Because sometimes I've seen countries in sub-Saharan Africa whereby they are going through a drought, but they are also taxing some of the things that could actually land on a plate of someone who is going through famine. And so you almost want to go to speak to business and say, what can we do? Can we actually go and speak to a minister with you to get some respite for the communities that are struggling? So for me, I guess the challenge I'm putting at the feet of some businesses is that join us and speak out with us to some people who have political power and can make a change.
Thank you so much, Keith. Yeah, we've had another question in around what can business practically do. And I think you've all picked up on that question to a large extent. But I guess as we're in our sort of final few minutes, I would ask you to maybe as if one call to action for those listening, particularly in the business community, and maybe an action that you might take yourself, and then that will bring us to a close. So perhaps I could start with you, Tatiana.
I wanted to comment and probably add a little bit to what Ian was saying. Basically, we were all talking about one thing. It's about business building a strong ecosystems around themselves. Because as Keith says, some of the businesses are more powerful than the states. So that is the major takeaway that I want to understand, the importance of your role, of the role of the business, and you have to be completely sure that you can change the world. The businesses can really influence. And as an example, Crown Agents, since the outbreak of the war, did not stop working in Ukraine for a single day. And mostly because our ecosystem that we created in Ukraine was absolutely great. And we were complementary to each other. And that is amazing. So I really encourage everybody to see and understand what is ecosystem around you and build the stronger partnerships. And through this partnership, influence. So that I think that's my most important takeaway from today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. Ian, I'll come to you.
I think for me, I'll do one personal, if I may. I think here in the UK, we do a lot of work in relation to Ukraine, but mostly as it relates to sort of the UK environment, civil society, government. But after today's discussion, I'm going to be much more proactive at involving Ukrainian civil society, Ukrainian businesses in those conversations, engagement, and try to be very proactive about that because obviously, as you said at the start, Tatiana, you're fully operational, you're there, and it's the future of the country is yours. So you should be involved in those discussions regardless of where they're happening.
Thank you, Ian. And Keith?
I will make, three very, very clear and brief requests. One, work with us to help get the mines out of Ukraine. Two, help us get some food down in the Horn of Africa. And three, work with us with resources and whatever you have to create resilience and food security in Sub-Saharan Africa. Those are the three things that I would request.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the panelists and to all of you for tuning in. But also as a thank you to the organizers of Sustainability for Ukraine. This is the 24 hours of important discussion, including GlobeScan, CSR Ukraine. Please do check out the agenda on sustainability4ua.org for the other great sessions that are happening across the 24 hours. But on that note, thank you so much.